Hello, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining. This lecture is done within the Future Environmentalist project, done with the support of Erasmus Plus program of European Union. My name is Jan Kaspar, and I work at Faculty of Forestry and Wood Sciences of Czech University of Life Sciences in Prague. And I am one of the coordinator of this project from the Czech partner. Today, Dr. Plesník, who is our invited lecturer, he will speak about current global issues, environmental protection, and nature conservation. He works at Nature Protection Agency of the Czech Republic, so I think he's the right person to present this issue for us today. I kindly remind you to keep your microphones muted unless you want to raise a question. You can ask during the lecture or at the end of the lecture. I will try to somehow manage the discussion. I also want to inform you that this webinar will be recorded, and later it will be available in YouTube and our educational toolkit website, which will be, you probably know it, or we will share the link later with you. We are sharing the link of this website also of the Facebook of the project, so you can simply follow it. So probably it's almost all from my side, and I would like to give the floor to Dr. Plesník and his presentation. So, Mr. Doctor, you can take the floor and continue.
Thank you very much, Professor Kaspar, for giving me the floor, and special thanks to all of you, namely those who have been continuing from the previous lecture. Hoping that you are not very tired or on the other side boring. So special thanks for your patience and for your interest. Now we can continue, and our...
Dr. Plesník, I'm sorry, we cannot see your presentation if you are already shared it.
Yes.
Just...
Also, if it is possible to put you on your camera so that we can see you.
Yeah.
Hello again.
Hello.
I'll try to read. So, now is better.
Yes, we see your presentation.
Yeah. So perfect. So I will continue. This was really some remembering us how important is our future by this man. Many people have used to laugh at him, but he was in fact a very wise man. And so what's wrong? And I would like to continue with the reminding us that since the late 1980s, bipolarity of the Earth has changed, because by the time, since the time of Cold War, there were two blocks, West and East, and it has changed. And now instead West and East, we have two bipolar world on the earth. One is called North and the other South. And it is important to say that this is not only geographically, because we have some countries which are on the southern hemisphere, which are in the fact developed. So North means developed, South developing countries. Because, for example, New Zealand, Australia are considered to be a North, although located geographically on the southern hemisphere. The photo, again, these are from my archive. I'm sure that you have recognized it, at least on the left. This is Empire State Building in the Manhattan, in the New York City downtown, and the photo right I took last October in Zambia. But this categorization, that means this bipolarity, has not been so clear. There are some subcategories. One is category countries with economy in transition. These are post-communist countries. These are countries.
Dear Mr. Plesník, excuse me for interrupting, but can you please, as the previous time, can you please start full screen sharing and also turn on your camera, because now we see the presentation, but it's not full screen.
So I will try, but I have full screen now on my. So I will try.
Maybe from beginning od zakatku.
Yeah, I will try it because yeah.
Mr. Plesník?
Yes, I'm trying to do it.
Yeah, okay. I just lost you for a minute.
Yeah, because. Now it's better.
You have to start sharing.
Yes, I have full screen again.
But press the button share.
I don't know what is it.
You have to start sharing screen.
Yeah, I have started. I have full screen here. I don't know where is the problem.
Not the full screen, but sharing your screen with us.
Yes, I put it there. Share screen. Now?
Now it started, yes.
Yeah. So apologize for this. So I will start again and saying that
Sorry to interrupt, Dr. Plesník. Now put on the full screen in the PowerPoint.
Yes, I have it. I have it here. I put it there. I see it now.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
Now it's okay.
Now it is perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm sorry. Please put your camera on.
Yeah. So I can continue. Let me start with the idea of this man who said that he's interested in his future because that is where he's going to spend the rest of his life. That means it is only remind us how it is future for us and for the planet. Most people, in the fact, were laughing at him, but he was quite a wise man. And let me remind us that by the late 1980s, bipolarity of the Earth had been from the time of the Cold War, that there were two parts of the world, different in many aspects, West and East. And it has changed, and since the late 1980s, we have two parts of the world called North and South. That means North are developed and South are developing countries. And I would like to stress the fact that this is not purely geographically, because we have some developed countries located in southern hemisphere, like, for example, Australia or New Zealand. But this is a synonym or politically more correct wording for developed, economically developed and developing countries. Again, I put photos from my archive. The left is well known. This is Empire State Building in the Manhattan in the New York City downtown, and the photo right I took in Zambia last October. But this division is not so clear. There are also some subcategories. One are countries with economy in transition, which are post-communist states which have not become a member of the European Union. Now, for example, this typical country is Vietnam or Albania, and these countries, the Czech Republic has been, of course, for some period also classified in this category, are countries which have some features, some characters similar to the West, like, for example, in my country, the level of healthcare or level of education, but on the other hand, some characters are typical for the developing countries, like the level of corruption. And therefore they are considered as sometimes, for example, by the United Nations as the third category, sometimes not. And also oil-rich countries, which are surprisingly, formally from geopolitical point of view, being developing countries, although they are relatively rich because of oil. The photo left is these are the famous Petronas Tower, the headquarters of the Malayan National Oil Company in Kuala Lumpur. That means that formally, although they are much more richer even than some countries in the West, they are considered still being developing countries. The very specific category or subcategory countries are so-called new economies, which are sometimes included under the abbreviation BRIICS. These are the first letters of their names. These are Brazil, the Russian Federation, India, Indonesia, China, and South Africa. I'm sure that you have recognized this photo from the famous China's site. Why they are called new economies? they have some common features. First, they have large country territories. All these countries are large. For example, the Russian Federation, the largest country, China, Indonesia, even South Africa. They have large human populations, that means dozens and hundreds of millions of inhabitants, and they have large natural resources. Together, they have huge potential for economic growth, and some countries of these countries are really very much developing further with respect of the economic growth, like China, we will reach it further, or Brazil. But now the question is now, I read yesterday in the Economist that probably they will be most vulnerable countries with respect of the COVID-19 pandemic disease. And they sometimes display a tendency to act on the international arena as a bloc. That means to coordinate themselves. And you know even that they have some summits. And before the economic crisis in 29 started, and there was the highest prices of oil, there was even the proposal made by the Russian President Putin to establish their own International Monetary Fund and to stop using US dollars or euros or Swiss francs for trade and instead to use gold ruble. That means that these countries are sometimes acting as a bloc, having quite strong voice in the international arena, so-called BRIICS or new economies. Another group of countries distinguished by the United Nations are called less developed countries. These are countries with the lowest GDP per capita. That means from economic point of view, not from point of view of nature quality, but from the economic point of view, these countries are the poorest one. Not surprisingly, 33 are located in Africa, 14 in Asia Pacific. These are namely the so-called small Pacific island countries. I will reach it later. And the only country from America, this is Haiti. And the photo left was taken in the countryside in West African country, Senegal. And small island developing states are 38, and these are namely small countries on islands in the Pacific, but also some small island countries in Central America, in the Caribbean Sea. And sometimes they are again acting on the international arena, for example, on the United Nations meetings or World Trade Organization meeting as a bloc countries, having together 38 votes. Only for illustrating the situation, the current situation, it is not necessary to remember it. I'm going to show to you some ranking of countries, and one is the nominal GDP last year according to the International Monetary Fund. That means this is in fact power of economy, the GDP. Of course, the first country with the nominal GDP are United States, then China, Japan, Germany, India, United Kingdom, France, Italy, Brazil, and Canada. First, you can see that we have some countries from so-called G8, that means the most important Western countries from a point of view of economy, but as well we have here you can see 3 countries from BRIICS. That means that these are according their economic power or economic effectiveness. The different view is when we calculate it so-called GDP by purchasing power parity. What does it mean? Does it mean that, for example, if you will produce one issue, for example, a pen, in the US, the price can be, in the fact, $10, but in China, because it is much more cheaper country, it will be $2. That means that when taking into account only nominal GDP, 1 pen means that the US economy should be 5 times more powerful than China. But the output, the pen, is the same. That means that we compare the prices in the consumer basket. And when taking into account not only the power of economy, but what you are able to buy in the country for $1, for example, then since 2014, the biggest economy is China, then the United States, then India, Japan, Germany, Russian Federation, Indonesia, Brazil, and United Kingdom and France. You can see that it quite changed the view, because now we are also assessing how cheap or how expensive is living in this country with respect of the economic power. Another view how we can ranking economies is the GDP per capita. Then means economic power per 1 inhabitant of the country. Again, I am going to use the data from the International Monetary Fund, and then the GDP per capita highest is Luxembourg. This is the only country having GDP per capita more than 100,000 US dollar per inhabitant. But this is not only because of the economy, but namely because of services, and namely because this is offshore country. That means there is a lot of headquarters of international companies, multi-companies, and banks located in Luxembourg and paying taxes there, because they are lower than in other countries in the European Union. The second per capita, GDP per capita country is Switzerland, then Norway, then Ireland, then Qatar, the first oil-rich country, then, excuse me, it should be Iceland now, not Ireland, but Iceland, then the US, Singapore, Denmark, and Australia. That means these are countries, some of them are because strong economy and few people, like for example Denmark or Ireland or Norway. Some are because of oil, like Qatar, and some because of offshore countries. That means that they are really using the opportunity that many foreign countries are located there. But this is not about the well-being, and there is something which is called Human Wealth Index for adults. That means that this is the index taking into account not only GDP per capita or for example, but also issues like expected lifespan. quality of healthcare, quality of education, social welfare, and that means how is well-being in this country. The best country with respect of living condition and human wealth index last year for adult is Switzerland, then Australia, then Iceland, then Hong Kong, Luxembourg, Belgium, New Zealand, Japan, Canada, and Ireland. You can see again that there are really in addition to really big countries like Canada or Australia, there are also small countries like Belgium or Iceland. But it is necessary to say that this is for the whole population consisting of adult people. If we, for example, take white Americans, then the US will be the second. Yeah, and for a long time, when using this human wealth index for adults, for example, 30 years ago or even before, the first country, but not country, but population were white South African. They have the best quality of life in the 1970s, in the 1980s. But when taking into account the population of all adults, then Switzerland is providing its citizens with the best condition for their life. And now we are reaching the topic of this lecture, and these are global issues. Global issues are difficulties caused by an irresponsible, reckless attitude of humans to Earth. That means problems which are caused by us, by humans. And one of the characteristics of the global issues is that they threaten all the humankind as a whole, the human society. Therefore, they are global, and they are unfortunately closely interrelated. That means that we couldn't save one global issue. Say, for example, let's start with this. We couldn't really solve these global issues per partes. That means each after each, because they are so closely interrelated. And which are the main types of global issues? First, wars. Still there are wars. You know that at this moment, in the fact, there are 150 wars. Most of them are local conflicts, and more than half of them, the topic of the war is water, in the fact. Yeah, that means still, but we are not facing the really some continent-wide war, or almost all local wars. Then environmental degradation. This will be debated later. This is the topic of this lecture. Then poverty and related issues like diseases or illiteracy. That means now very important when the world has been facing this new coronavirus disease. Then so-called social conflicts and social pathological issues like racism, narcotics, crimes, including cybercrime as a new type of crime, but very spread now. Terrorism as the last type of the global issues. Features, in addition to what I have said, they cannot be solved separately. They cannot be solved in a single country or in a region of the world. So we couldn't say that, for example, cyber crime could be solve only within the European Union or within the Czech Republic. The reduction needs combination of legal, social, economic, and political tools. That means that we couldn't use, when combating them, only legislation or law or enforcement or some, let me say, subsidies or other economic issues or political tools like, for example, special programs and so on. And the approach should be intersectorial. That means that, for example, illiteracy should not be reduced or eradicated only by the sector of education. Environment-related global issues cannot be handled only by the ministries of the environment or appropriate ministries dealing with the environment. The intersector approach is definitely needed and is in the fact a must. Then, where is the root of the problem? The root of problem is in ratio in some issues between North and South. First, natural resources, the ratio is 1:4. That means that in the North, that means in the developed countries, there is only 20% of the natural resources available. Most resources are located in the developing countries. On the other hand, total consumption is quite vice versa, quite opposite. That means that developed countries consume 80% of the global consumption. Energy per capita, the consumption is 10:1, and water per capita is 3:1. And the problems, some global problems raised from this non-equal division of some issues between North and South. It is not 1:1, as you can see from this table. Which are the environment-related global issues? I would like to stress the fact that I will go through it briefly, because some years ago I also read the course which was entitled Global Nature Conservation, but the course was merged with this conservation policy. So we have not so much time really to deal with these issues in detail. So I will go through, and I'm sure that you have heard about most, not about, probably also about all of them. First is ozone layer depletion, which is sometimes given us, even by the United Nations Secretary General, as the most successful story in the environmental protection during last 40 years, because Montreal Protocol was agreed in 1987 and entered into force in 1989. And it aimed on the chlorofluorocarbons, which were banned, and the ban was so successful that we have now some recovery of ozone holes. And what is the problem at this moment? The problem is that the CFCs are so-called POPs. That means persistent organic pollutants, which are able to be present in the environment dozens of years after their application. That means that although that they have been banned and they have been replaced by some other chemicals which are not so dangerous to the upper ozone layer, still their effect is here. And unfortunately, from point of view of the greenhouse gases, they are approximately 100 or 1000 more effective than CO2. That means that they are able really, although still in low concentration, they are able even to contribute to the greenhouse effect. This situation has been much more better than, for example, 30 years ago when, for example, in Australia, the skin cancer was the most common, and there was even an act in Australia if a child came into school without sunglasses or some cap, the teacher had to send him back to home because school was not able to be in charge. And at the time there were even some direct death, because you know that the greatest ozone hole is above Antarctic still. There are also some ozone holes in Central Europe. For example, if you will be there in the second half of May, usually there is temperature in the Czech Republic 25, 28 centigrades. There is a lot of light in the landscape. You can take perfect photos, and this is that because there is the ozone hole above Central Europe from the half of May to the beginning of June. All of us, it is closing approximately 6-7 June, but still it is here. It is quite a successful story, but not absolutely successful because of this persistency of these CFCs. Other environment-related global issue is contamination, mainly by, as I mentioned just a while before, persistent organic pollutants and acidification. The problem, and I apologize to students who were listening to my lecture during the conservation biology, there is at this moment almost 160 million chemical substances registered. Approximately 100,000 are commonly used, but effect on human health and the environment has been known in 3,000 to 4,000 only. That means we have really, this is ticking bomb. We have a little knowledge about the chemicals which are in the world around us, and sometimes therefore some of these chemicals come as a surprise. For example, micropollutants, these are the, for example, the remnants of pharmaceuticals which are, for example, in water, which are extremely effective in low concentrations, and they are disrupting some pathway in human body. And when the problems had arrived 15 or 20 years ago, it was recognized that there are only 5 countries where there was a research on this issue. Now we know it, but still it is the problem, because you know that some of these micropollutants cannot be removed even using the current top high technology in water treatment stations. And the example of these POPs are also pesticides, namely the neonicotinoids, which were tested in high concentration because they are micropollutants. It looks like that everything is okay, but in low concentrations, they are really threatening or endangering, namely insect pollinators, honeybees and bumblebees, because they are attacking their brain ganglion. That means that the honeybee is in the fact not effective because it would be poison, but the honeybee is in the fact making crazy to to its death. And therefore, these neonicotinoids have been banned in the European Union. We spent 7 years of debate at the various meetings in Brussels and Strasbourg, but now it was done. Still, we are waiting. Now it's question not only time because of this disease problem, but still they are not banned by the federal act in the US. Eutrophication, as that means that loading of nutrients, namely phosphorus and nitrogen in the environment, and humans have been producing more nitrogen than all the natural processes. That means that we are producing more nitrogen than nature itself at this moment, used namely for the fertilizers. Loading nitrogen and phosphorus in the terrestrial, freshwater and marine environment is now very common. This is sometimes underestimated because people, in the best sense of the word, ordinary people met this problem, namely if they are seeking for bathing in nature, but this is really a huge problem. For example, you know that this in freshwater there are the algal or cyanobacteria or blue algae blooms, and the output is that these blooms are not only toxic for people, namely children with some allergies, but also they are reducing the level of oxygen in fresh water. This is well known, but what is less known is that there are so-called dead zones in seas. These are part of the seas which are close to the big river deltas, estuaries, for example, Rhona Delta or Danube Delta. You can see them using Google images, and you will see that there is dark patch close to these deltas, and this is dead zones. There is so low level of oxygen that there is no life. And these are hundreds or thousands of square kilometers. But it is not so known because it is namely for people like us living in the landlocked country, having no seas. But this is really not only problem of fresh water, but unfortunately in this moment the problem of the seas. Climate change, I will be very simple. I guess that there are 3 questions related to the climate change. First is this really change in climate or the fluctuation in some natural range of values? The second is, if this is change, it is really caused by greenhouse gases. And the third question is, if this is caused by greenhouse gases, it is caused namely by humans. And if you will see the report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPC, the Nobel Prize winner, the very first report published in 1990 said that first answer, probably, second, we don't know, and the third, we don't know. The last report saying yes, yes, yes. But the problem is that from pure scientific point of view, we are not able to come with the direct evidences because this should be done only by the experiment. And therefore there is still the debate about the climate change and will be. But I would like to stress that we are going to say climate change instead global warming, because climate change has other effects than only the rise or increase in the temperature of the environment. And in addition, there are some parts of the world where the average temperature is not increasing but decreasing. That means that this part of the world is becoming colder. For example, some part of the South America, like Patagonia, or some parts of the Scandinavia in Europe. So therefore it is better to say climate change, not only simply global warming, because global warming is a part of the climate change. Then for both human and society and nature, extreme weather events like floods, droughts, heat waves, frost events, strong winds are more serious threat than continuing temperature rise. Why? Because during your personal life, you will feel more if you will be attacked by these extreme weather events than if then you are reading in some journal or newspaper that the average temperature rise 1.1 centigrade. That means that these extreme weather events are for both society and nature more visible, and we can really face them. Instead, the continuing temperature rise. By the way, both animals and plants are adapting themselves not to the rising temperature, but to these extreme weather events. That is the term I would like to really mention when speaking about climate change, and these are so-called nature-based solutions, and nature-based solutions for climate change mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation, I'm sure that you have heard it, is process how to reduce the negative effect of climate change by reducing the greenhouse, namely reducing the greenhouse emission. Adaptation means that we are going to adapt ourselves to the climate change. This is quite important issue because I remember that 21 years ago when we were starting to negotiate with the European Commission, the Czech Republic membership in the European Union, in the chapter called the environment, we presented to the European Commission in Brussels our national adaptation strategy, and we were said that it is nonsense that everything will be done by the mitigation. We know that it is not possible because although some effects of the climate change, greenhouse gases levels will be functioning even when the emission shall be stopped. And nature-based solutions means that we are using nature to help us with the climate change mitigation and adaptation. I'm going to deal with one of the next presentation with this issue using, for example, as I mentioned, peat bogs instead biofuels, using the capacity of floodplain forest to really act against the floods or so on. But to be honest, sometimes we should really be able to use only technology. Ideally, we can use nature-based solutions because they are cheaper and more natural and sometimes more effective. Sometimes we have used combination of the technological solution and nature-based solution, and sometimes we should really use only the technological solutions for combating climate change negative effect. And at this moment, climate change is perceived as the most important global issue by the general public and the decision makers. On one hand, it is good news because really the problem is global, displaying all these characters I have mentioned before. But on the other hand, there is the danger that most capacities, human capacities, financial capacities, and so on, will be allocated for this climate change. And as I mentioned, all these global issues are interrelated. It is important, but to be honest, it is unfortunately not the only global issues suffering us living on this planet. The next is land degradation, because a quarter of the Earth's ice-free land area is subject to human-induced degradation. That means that 25% of the terrestrial land has been degraded by humans. And soil erosion from agriculture fields is estimated to be currently 10 to 20 times where there is no tillage, to more than 100 times if there is conventional tillage, higher than the soil formation rate. That means, very simply, soil is really missing from our ecosystem much more quicker that the new soil has been formed. That means that we are losing really the soil, namely the upper layer, the most fertile, and we are really much more related to this process. And there is primary desertification, which is a process in which a relatively dry land region becomes increasingly arid, typically losing its water bodies, vegetation, and wildlife. Simply said, primary desertification is creating new deserts or spreading the old desert. You know that this is the biggest problem in part of the Africa called Sahel. This is a strip from the Gambia to the Ethiopia along the southern borders of the Sahara Desert. And this is really a problem because in some respect, the life is in this part of the world much more difficult, harder than in the Sahara Desert itself. But there is also something, and drivers include various factors, namely climatic variations and human activities, because it is unbelievable that some millennia ago, even century ago, Sahara was in the fact a green garden. But in addition to the primary desertification, there is so-called secondary desertification. And this is the land degradation outside drylands caused by soil overexploitation by agriculture, resulting in the same soil quality patterns as desert. That means these are part of the world where soil has been so overexploited that it has become sterile. It is not able really to be fertile anymore. That means that this is dead soil. And these are, for example, southern part of France, some parts of Ukraine, which were producing harvest, have been producing harvest more than 2 millennia, some parts of the Netherlands, some part of the US, but also some parts of the Czech Republic. If the concentration of the upper soil level is less than 1% of the soil, that means that then the secondary desertification starts. I always remember that some years ago I was examining a student from an unnamed country with the capital Madrid, and I asked her about secondary desertification, and she said that scent and some animal probably became, but this is not a fact. This is secondary desertification is 50 kilometers from Prague or close to Kiev and not far from Marseille. There are no dunes, but the quality of soil is so bad that is the same like in Sahara or the deserts in Australia or the Atacama Desert in South America. Then overconsumption is the issue I'm going still to deal it in a few minutes. The other global issue related to the environment is waste management, including plastics. You know that now this is really a politically hot issue because world plastic production has increased 20 times since 1960 only, and 90% of plastics have not been recycled yet on the planet. And you know that, for example, a PET plastic bottle is able to persist in the environment for 150 years. That means that the problem is if these plastics are moved by the water, by rivers to the seas. In seas there is 5.2 trillion plastic pieces, including microplastics, because plastics are really degraded into small particles in nanometers by solar radiation. But the problem is that these microplastics are able to actively capture substances which are causing cancer in humans. These plastic pieces are not only these so-called garbage patches, like Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is in the northwest from the Hawaii Island. And I remember 20 years ago, I said during these lectures that the area of these patches of the plastics in the sea is approximately the same like Germany. Last year it was almost 2 million square kilometers of sea cover, which is sea level, which is covered by plastics. You know that there are various campaigns and laws on reduction of disposable single-use plastic like straws, beakers, cutleries, and so on. To be honest, this is very much important from point of view of education, because we can do something to reduce the flow of plastics into seas. But the problem is that the idea to stop this was made when scientists analyzed the structure of plastic waste on beaches. And then this plastics was relatively important. But when going to these parts of the world ocean, when the currents are meeting and when are these garbage patches, you recognize that this disposable single-use plastics is less than 1% in volume of these plastics there. If we would like to do something with the plastics in sea, we should go to fishermen, because almost half by volume of plastics in the sea are fishery nets, because you know that these nets are, for example, 60, 100 kilometers long, each 5 meters. There is a hook where, for example, a bait is put, and if they are, for example, damaged by water or wind, fishermen simply put it and leave them in the seas. And these are the main issue, the main problem, not our straws and beakers. And also the problem is that there is no law to reduce this. There are no subsidies, for example, for fishermen when they will put back their degraded nets. And even in the European Union regulation on plastic waste, it is only recommendation. Why we have a limit with the straws. I'm not saying that this disposable single-use plastic is good. No. I'm saying that the root of problems are not here, and also the root of problems are not in the North countries. These are the most important producers of waste, which is then capturing by seas are countries like India, Indonesia, Thailand. For example, plastic bags. And the first country, when ranking according to plastic waste, are the United States, and they are the 8th. That means, for example, the European Union produces less than 5% of the global plastic waste. So if we are going to do something with plastic in sea, we should negotiate and really to speak with our colleagues from the developing countries. There is another term I would like to mention, and this is E8, and this is the 8 most important countries with respect of the global environment, ranked by the World Resources Institute, which is the NGO based in the Washington, DC, and these countries are US, Japan, Germany, UK, China, Brazil, the Russian Federation, and India. These are analogy to G8. These are the 8 most important countries from point of view of economy. These are the most important countries with respect of the global environment. There is something which is called a type of schizophrenia. I have introduced this term because this is the term for the European and US public. That means that we enjoy a high input lifestyle, and at the same time we, through unsustainable consumption, destroy nature within and outside Europe, although strongly supporting environment protection, at least by words. This is a type of schizophrenia. If you will ask Europeans or the Americans about the environment, they will always say this is important, government should do, I can do something this, but we are not very much willing to change our conception, our style of life. And I would like to show the importance of the overconsumption using this value, this variable, which is called average consumption unit per year, and which is the average consumption per citizen. And this variable is 1 in Africa. That means that this is approximately only the consumption maintaining you to be a living person. It is in Africa. In Asia, the consumption generally is 1.5 higher. In Europe, 4.5 higher. And in the US, Australia, and Canada is 9 times higher. That means that each American has the same consumption like 9 people in Africa. But the total consumption, not per capita, not per head, per 1 person, in 3 or 4 commodities, namely coal, meat, and energy, has been higher in China than in the US. The oil is the exception. That means that globally, from the point of view of consumption of some resources, the China is at this moment more important than the US, although US having this highest average consumption unit per year. In China, there is more numerous middle class population than in the US. 250 million Chinese people are considered to be middle class. That means that they have their own flats or house, they have car, they have some average salary and so on. And fortunately for us, this middle class in China has not accepted our overconsumption style of life. You can see it on the right, where there is the meat consumption. The red is China, and the blue is the US. And it is in million tons that you can see that even in meat, although the Chinese people are really polite, there is really now almost twice consumption of the meat in China than in the US. But unfortunately, also the Chinese society has started to adopt Western consumption patterns. And then really we will be in troubles if this society will display the same consumption patterns like in the European Union or in the US, Canada, Australia, and so on. And the main driver, the main factor responsible for the global environment-related issues is a human population growth. This is called demographic tsunami. You can see it here. That means that the upper part, light yellow, is the population in the developing countries, and the dark yellow or the lower parts is population in industrialized regions. And you can see that in the developing countries, this is really exponential growth, really tsunami. I can demonstrate it on the human population size in billions. At the time of the Napoleon Bonaparte, there was approximately 1 billion people on the earth. In the late 1920s, it was 2. In 1963, 1974, 4. Then 1987, 5. A year before the new millennium started, it was 6. And 9 years ago, we reached 7 million. What you can see is that the period between a new billion of people appeared on the planet has becoming shorter and shorter. And it is expected that in 7 years we will reach 8 billion people. You can see it, this is United Nations World Population Projection. Green is low scenario, blue is medium, and the red is high. And now we are dealing with a question I have mentioned during the previous presentation, and where is the Earth's carrying capacity? Where is the capacity of the planet to really to have viable but still not threaten human capacity. The problem is that expert opinion varies between 1 to 100 billion inhabitants. 1 billion, it is the estimation by some demographs saying that we reach the human capacity at the time of the Napoleon, and that we are really over-consuming future of our children and grandchildren. 100 billion inhabitants, this is the estimation made by so-called environmental optimists. This is a school of scientists being very close to the Republican Party in the United States. But mostly, the carrying capacity of the Earth for humans is estimated to be 15 to 20 billion human beings. That means that still we are not reaching it, but the problem is that this is the Earth as a whole. And we have been reaching this carrying capacity in some region of the world, as I'm going to show to you later. One issue which was very much on the agenda of politicians, namely in the 1950s and 1960s, was whether the planet is able to feed all human population. And there was the so-called Green Revolution, which failed in environmental issue. What is the Green Revolution? Green Revolution is nothing with Greenpeace or environmental movements. Green Revolution is the idea which appeared in the 1940s, and the idea is that if we will be applying some methods, like in developed countries, also in developing countries, we are able to feed the whole human population even in the future without problems. This idea was partially successful, as I'm going to show to you, but failed in environmental issues. That means that the development of agriculture was done at the same time with the environment degradation in many parts of the world. And there is so-called New Green Revolution or Evergreen Revolution, which is paying more efforts to be environmental friendly. This is the approach or movement started approximately 15 years ago, and it is using the modern high technology. For example, pesticides are spread not by, for example, planes for the whole landscape or the whole field, but by drones to the individual plant. There is no irrigation for fields, there is irrigation for every individual plant, every individual crop, and so on. And you know that this the Green Revolution is very much supported by the richest people in the world. For example, Bill Gates has been providing each year almost $2 billion for this new green revolution in the developing world. But still the problem is not that there will be only less food available. The problem is the distribution of the food, because still there are losses in crop production, harvest, and transport up to 13% annually. And this is in South, this is real loss because bad infrastructure, bad transport, bad possibility to stock the crops and so on. But in the north, we are wasting 30% of food as an average. And it needs to change the so-called consumption patterns, the way we are consuming the food. And this is really a problem because, for example, some years ago, there was a poll among Americans. It was done by the most respected agency, Gallup Institute in the US. And you know that for the pool, you need to have at least 1,001 people to be asked. And in this case, it was 10,000. That means it was quite good sample of respondent in the US. And the question was very simple. Are you willing to change your style of life? Are you willing to reduce your consumption patterns? And the answer by Americans, most of them say no. They said what we are going to change is that we are asking for more high quality food from organic farming and so on, but the amount will not be changed. And you know that during that before this called Air Summit or the United Nations Conference on the Environment and Development in Rio de Janeiro started in June 1992. And when President Bush arrived, he simply said at the airport, I'm not going to undersign any treaty which would change our style of life. And by the way, that is why the United States have not become a party to the Convention on Biological Diversity. May I ask you whether I should stop, whether there are some questions or whether I should continue? Because still 10 minutes, it's less 10 minutes.
Okay, maybe you can finish your presentation and then we can have some question. I identify one question on the chat.
Yeah.
So then I can read it and you can answer, and we will see if somebody else will add some other.
Yeah, and then I can continue to quarter past. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the question, please.
The question is, where is the data for consumption units per year taken from? What is the source of the data?
Yeah, the data are taken from United Nations Development Program.
Okay, so hopefully it's a sufficient answer. So, is there another question from audience? Oh. Okay, so please continue and we will see at the end.
Yeah. The good news is that there has been a dramatic decline in numbers of people in primary malnutrition. That means people with lack of food. You know that 40 years ago it was 2 billion. At that time it was 40% of the human population. Now it is 0.8 billion people. That means this is very good result of the Green Revolution. That means that the number of people who are lacking food, so-called primary malnutrition, has been declining dramatically. What is the bad news is that there is still 2 billion people really with overconsumption. That means that the overconsumption has been more difficult problem than it was 20 years ago and so on. And this is so-called primary malnutrition because we have also the secondary malnutrition, which is common even in the developed world. And this is that you have a lack of, you have plenty of food, you have even overconsumption, but you are lacking some, for example, pro-vitamins or some rare elements in your food. That means that from a point of quantity, you are even overloaded. But from a point of view of quality, you are not receiving all what is necessary for your health. And this is so-called secondary malnutrition, and this is even a problem in countries like the UK or the United States. Then I would like to show you some terrestrial land use patterns. It is not necessary to remember, it is only to illustrate. We have global Europe, EU, and Czech Republic. This is percentage of cropland. You can see that the cropland area is almost doubled in Europe when compared to the global value. Then grassland. You know, this is the problem in Europe and the EU, that we have less grassland because most grassland in the Europe was changed into cropland, and we have no biomes like North American prairies or South American pampas or steppes in Mongolia or southern Siberia. Then forest. There will be a special lecture on the state of the forest as the very last lecture during this course, so I can jump over, skip off. Shrubs, we have no data because some shrubs are considered to be a part of forest, but you can see that still 8% in Europe because of course, namely in the Mediterranean area. Water areas, relatively low numbers with respect of coverage. Wetland, we have no data from global, but from Europe, and you see that still this is a result of the wetland degradation. And birdland, which is both iceland or land covered by ice or desert, and built up areas. You can see that in Europe and the EU we have really almost 4 times built up areas than the rest of the world. I have mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals, so I can only mention that there are non-quantitative goals with a few targets. That means this is that something should be reached. There are some sub-targets, but there are no quantified targets to be measured, but the progress we can measure by the set of the indicators. And as I mentioned, and unfortunately, no special funds and capacities have been allocated for the Sustainable Development Goals implementation. And there is United Nations Development Program, UNDP, as I mentioned, is used, namely voluntary contribution from the United Nations member states. It is aiming at advices, education, training, and grants. No funding for huge infrastructure from this United Nations program. But there is Global Environment Facility, which was established to support developing countries in environmental issues. It was in fact established just at the Rio Summit, and it is funded by developed countries. Projects have been implemented in 170, that means in most countries in the world. And Originally, it aimed at 3 topics which are covered by the international treaties: biological diversity, climate change, and land degradation. That means biodiversity, climate change, and combating desertification. But because these developed countries were not willing to pay more for some other issues from the GEF, now it is also funded, funds come for international water conservation, ozone layer protection, persistent organic pollutants and mercury combating, sustainable forest management, and food security. You can see, and cities, the last one. You can see that on the one hand, it is good that there are special funds available for the global environment related issues, but the problem is that there is more and more topics added, and the amount of money is not increasing accordingly. That means that relatively there is less and less money available. The World Bank is an international financial institution that provides loans and grants to the governments of poor countries for the purpose of pursuing capital projects since 1944. That means for really investment. And the main goal is the reduction of poverty. And I can say that when I visited the World Bank headquarters in Washington, DC, for the first time, I was really surprised because there has been a reception which is like a small railroad station in this country, and there is a marble wall, and in the marble wall it is written in gold letters: "Our dream is the world without poverty." So for me it was like a type of irony. And recently it has been funding climate change mitigation and adaptation, and this is some controversy because sometimes they are really, for example, the World Bank officials said 3 years ago that they are stopping funding the fossil fuel usage. But this is not the case. NGO confirmed that the funding of fossil fuel consumption has been continuing from World Bank. So on one hand, they are saying that they are combating climate change, but on the other, they are supporting it financially. And the problem is that contrary to the United Nations bodies, where one country is one vote, in the World Bank, this is not the case. For example, the US have 25% of votes, China has 4%, and there are some countries who have no votes in the World Bank. That means that this is still old-fashioned division of the world. And the last issue I would like to mention is official development assistance, which is the assistance, financial assistance from government from a developed country to a government to government of a developing country. That means from government to government. And at the Rio Summit, it was agreed that it should be 1.7% of the GDP as a target from developed countries. 2018, only Sweden, Luxembourg, Norway, and Denmark met the target. That means paid more than 1.7% of their GDP to the official development assistance. US, for example, you know that they are paying 1/3 than expected. It is almost the same in a relative way as the Czech Republic, but absolutely in billions, of course, because of the US economy. US are the biggest, in the fact, country paying the biggest amount of money to the ODA, then Germany and UK. And you know that it was namely because the former US President Obama doubled the ODA to Africa from the US. But there is a huge China development investment in the South, particularly Africa, because China is sometimes together with the developing countries forming so-called China plus 77 political blocs, which are trying to really to vote as one entity. And China is aiming at strategic natural resources, for example, some rare chemical elements available in Africa. And the problem is the UN heavy machinery, that the UN is not so flexible. Up to 20% funds are spent as overhead costs. That means, for example, World Bank or the UNEP is taking 20% of funds for their operations. Therefore, the salaries are so high in this institution. In Africa, 40 to 80% of funds from ODA for healthcare and 50% for infrastructure are leaked. That means they are stolen by local people. And in some countries, ODA creates a privileged bunch of people misusing it, like former Zaire, Afghanistan, North Korea. And last slide will be dealing that the post-COVID-19 global development is quite uncertain. There will be definitely new priorities. The question is whether the environment issue will be still on high attention of politicians and decision makers and the general public. There will be a problem because there is a United Nations scale for membership fees. That means that the membership fees is paid based on the GDP per capita and number of inhabitants. That means that they are big payers of contribution to United Nations, like that means rich countries with huge population like United States, Japan, Germany, and now it will be lower because GDP will be definitely lower across the world. The question is whether there will be new global economic patterns, and of course, the role of official and private development assistance. So, thank you very much for your patience, and really, if there are more questions, I'm still able to answer.
Okay, thank you very much. Please, Dr. Plesník, if you can turn on your camera that everybody can see you when you will answer. If you will go to the panel down of your screen, you can, on the left side, you can see the start video.
Start video, yeah.
Perfect. So there is one question. There is one question from the chat. So I will read it.
Yeah.
What kind of measures would effectively reduce overconsumption, waste reduction, local food subsidies, education? Seems to not work well. Anything else? So what kind of measures would effectively reduce?
I guess, in my opinion, still it is very much about education. It is still very much about education. But the problem is, as I mentioned, if there will be better distribution of foods, that means that in the fact, you know that the food is enough here, and this is unfortunately about prices, and this is about the green revolution still. If you will be able to go for food in a good US restaurant and you will pay $30 and if you are going to go to good movie, to good cinema, you will pay twice more. If in some part of the world the food will be so cheap, then I'm aware that there is little chance. I always mention, and probably I said it also during my very first lecture, face-to-face, that when I visited the Smithsonian Institution Museum of Aviation and Aeronautics, it is publicly open and so on, and I was there, and it is this single building which is visited by the highest number of people in the world. And when I was there, so I went to the for lunch, and there was only fast food, of course, but there was only one empty seat, and I was sitting then. I was close to garbage coins, and it was unbelievable. It was unbelievable because there was really, for example, a part of chicken, and it was unused and thrown. And then I remember when I was in Ethiopia, it was during normal year, there was no famine, and we went from Addis Ababa, and people and mother with children were jumping in front of our car and asked us for any food, for any water. And it was very nice to see that there were lorries with the food, for example, a present of Swiss government, a gift of the Norwegian government, and a gift of you too. But it is not solution. We can feed the people for some time, namely for night, but the solution is better distribution and to do something with the agriculture production.
Thank you for your answer. Next question on the chat is, what measures can developing countries use to stop China investing in those countries?
I guess that this is also very difficult because, Chinese have very good approach because they are coming to these countries as saying, we are never been colonists. We have been suffering from these bad guys from the West in the early 20th century. We are your friends and we are helping you. And they are able to put there a lot of capacities. For example, there are some countries in Africa where the Chinese community is more than in some 100,000 of people. Yeah, and they are even respecting. I recently watched a movie at the BBC. It was from southern Sweden, the poorest country in the world, but still having some oil resources. All oil is taken by Chinese, and the question is, do you have some problems that your workers are Muslims? And the answer is no. We can respect it. We are not Western countries coming and saying you should adopt our style of life. And the only issue is, for example, in my opinion, that there will be more international aid from Western countries than from China, but really as a help, not as an investment. Because according to the official data from the French government, €1 invested in former French colonies is returning back to Paris as €5. And this is not about aid, this is not about help, this is simply about investment.
Okay, maybe Olale Khan could ask himself, because there is another question from him on the chat. What are these Chinese really looking for in those developing countries? What do you think?
I think that they are not looking really to establish a new imperium. They are simply looking for the resources. You know, because this is only the question of time, sorry to say, when there will be the biggest economy, even according to nominal GDP. And I can show to you, for example, there are so-called rare earth elements. These are very rare elements, chemical elements, which are extremely important for high technology, including, for example, mobile phones and so on. And they are available in some African countries. Therefore, Chinese are here. They bought a license, and they are also extremely effective. For example, you know that there was a so-called East African Railroad coming from Mombasa to Nairobi, built by British developers, and now it is old, and Chinese say we will do it in less than a year. And back to this, and what are they doing? They are really coming from resources, and it can be also demonstrated that these rare earth elements are also available outside Africa. It is a country which is not so known, but it is the second most important part of the world with respect of strategic rare chemical elements, and this is Greenland. And they in Greenland, they really now are coming. They have bought licenses from the local government, not from the Danish government. And to be honest, they are doing a lot of issue for supporting the effort of Greenland to be independent from Denmark.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there some other questions from audience? If not, it's probably time to have a dinner. And I'm looking forward to next webinars on Friday. So we will share the links with you again. Thank you very much to everybody for listening us, and thank you very much to Dr. Plesník to take the lecture today for us. Thank you very much and have a nice evening.
No, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to express my thanks to all of you for patience. And now have a big rest and see you on Friday.
Goodbye.
Bye.